Harry and Meghan's detractors have been calling for them to be stripped of their HRH since they left the royal family over 5 years ago. But those calls seem to be growing louder and from a more widespread community.
On January,
It was a morning like any other in the grand halls of the palace. Sunlight spilling through the tall windows, reflecting off polished marble floors, the faint echo of footsteps reverberating down long corridors. Tea had been poured at 8 o'clock as usual, and the palace seemed calm, ordinary, almost serene. But inside the private study of King Charles, a tension hung in the air that could be felt with every heartbeat. The king, 77 years old now, sat alone, his hands trembling slightly as he held his reading glasses. Portraits of monarchs who had ruled before him lined the walls, silent witnesses to centuries of history, their painted eyes staring down as if expecting him to make the impossible choice he now faced. For decades, Charles had balanced duty and family, tradition and emotion, love and responsibility, and he had known, deep down, that there would come a day when the weight of the crown would demand something personal, something unbearable. That day had arrived. A folder rested on the desk in front of him, sealed with red wax and carrying information that would change everything. The word that began it all, investigation, had been whispered in private channels for hours, traveling from diplomatic back doors to security offices, all pointing to one source, the Duke of Sussex. For years, Harry and Meghan had lived apart from the family, stepping away from royal duties, creating a life across the ocean in California. Detractors had long called for the stripping of titles, citing their departure and public statements. But now it was no longer a matter of opinion or personal conflict. This was a matter that involved questions of state, of security, and of risk. And Charles understood, in a way that no father ever wants to, that his own son could represent a danger, not through malice, but through carelessness and circumstance. As he stared at the folder, the quiet of the palace pressed in on him. He thought of Harry as a boy, bright-eyed, full of laughter, running barefoot across the gardens, scraped knees and muddy hands, evidence of endless curiosity. He thought of the funerals, the moments of grief shared, the ways a family had tried to hold together in the face of tragedy. And yet, that child was gone now, replaced by a man who had chosen a path far from the crown, a man who had surrounded himself with people whose loyalty was not to Britain, not to the institution, and perhaps not even fully to himself. Charles' advisers had entered quietly, faces pale and solemn, carrying folders marked with urgency, their presence a reminder that this was not just a private matter. Words were exchanged carefully, measured, each one loaded with meaning. The king listened, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him, aware that any misstep could have consequences reaching far beyond the palace walls. The world outside went about its ordinary business, unaware of the storm brewing inside, unaware that history was about to record a moment of extraordinary fracture, a choice that would test not only the bonds of family, but the strength of the monarchy itself. The folders lay unopened, a promise of disruption and pain. And yet, Charles understood that duty required him to act. He could not allow emotion to guide his decisions, not when the stakes were so high. The advisers explained the findings, each phrase deliberate, each word chosen to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing too much. The investigation had not begun as a royal matter, but had been triggered by external agencies observing patterns and connections, financial and social, that could not be ignored. Foreign interests, communication flags, associations that appeared innocent but were vulnerable to exploitation, all were outlined with clinical precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Charles's stomach tightened with each detail, his mind racing through every scenario, every possible outcome, imagining the consequences if this information were to become public. The responsibility he carried was not only for the crown, but for the people of the United Kingdom, and for the stability of an institution that had endured for centuries. Personal feelings, love for his son, memories of shared grief and joy, all had to be set aside, as impossible as that felt. In his mind, he revisited the moments that had led to this day: Harry's childhood adventures, his youthful recklessness, the choices made in adulthood that had created a distance between father and son. The advisors spoke of risk, of vulnerability, of the need to act swiftly to contain potential fallout. Charles understood immediately that inaction could be more damaging than the decision itself, that any delay would signal weakness and invite speculation. His mind flashed to his own parents, to moments in history when decisions had been made not for comfort or family, but for survival of the crown. He thought of Victoria, Edward VIII, George V, each having faced situations where personal desires were subordinate to duty. And now it was his turn. A king forced to choose between his son and the stability of everything he had spent his life serving. Every instinct screamed at him to call Harry, to warn him, to explain, to plead. But Charles knew that such a call would compromise his own resolve, would allow emotion to interfere with the immutable logic of duty. The decision had to be executed cleanly, without hesitation, without sentiment, and with the full weight of authority that the crown commanded. As the hours passed, advisers filed in and out. Discussions were had in hushed tones, and the king continued to sit, absorbing the enormity of what he faced. Each page of the report reinforced the unavoidable truth. Harry's actions, though perhaps well-intentioned, had created vulnerability that could not be ignored. There were no personal vendettas here, no anger driving the decision, only the cold, inescapable arithmetic of responsibility. Charles felt the familiar ache of inevitability, the crushing weight of knowing that once the pen touched the paper, nothing could undo what would follow. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, the ordinary rhythm of London muted by the quiet urgency behind closed doors. It was in that stillness that Charles recognized the ultimate truth of monarchy. The individual must be sacrificed for the institution, the personal subordinated to the historical, the father set aside for the king. In the background, the sound of church bells drifted through the halls, their ordinary tolls a stark contrast to the extraordinary decision that was about to be made. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy, each heartbeat a reminder of the cost of duty. And yet, there was clarity in the inevitability, a grim understanding that this was the path history had carved for him. He reached for the folder at last, breaking the seal with careful precision, the sound small, but carrying the weight of destiny. The first pages laid out the findings, clinical, factual, and damning. Charles read slowly, deliberately, absorbing each word, each implication, understanding fully that his son, his youngest son, had become a liability, not through malice, but by choices that had exposed vulnerabilities beyond what could be permitted. And in that quiet moment, he knew that the decision, though personal and devastating, was unavoidable. His hand shook only slightly as he picked up the pen to sign the formal document that would strip Harry of his titles, remove his official connection to the royal family, and begin a fracture that would be felt across the world. History, advisors, protocol, and constitutional requirement demanded it. There was no anger in his action, no vindictiveness, only the steady, deliberate weight of necessity. And as the ink flowed, as the pen moved across the page, Charles felt the personal cost as sharply as the institutional imperative. Outside, life continued. London moved, unaware, ordinary in every way, while inside the palace, a father became only a king, and the machinery of monarchy executed a decision that would echo for generations. After the initial shock of the report, King Charles' eldest son, Prince William, arrived quietly at the palace, summoned without ceremony or announcement. There were no cameras, no press statements, only the hushed urgency of a family in crisis. William entered the private study, the same room where his father had read the folder hours earlier, filled with portraits of past monarchs, whose eyes seemed to watch every decision. He did not greet Charles with warmth or embrace. There was no time for sentiment, no room for emotion. Instead, he moved with the careful precision of a man trained to weigh every gesture, every look, every word. The distance between father and son felt immense, though they were separated only by a few steps, a few moments. Charles gestured to a chair, and William sat, hands resting calmly in his lap, his posture exact and disciplined, revealing none of the anxiety he undoubtedly felt. Charles began to explain, not every detail, but enough to convey the gravity of the situation. He spoke of risk, of vulnerabilities that had been uncovered, of connections and associations that, when seen together, painted a troubling picture. William listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing, yet his mind processed every word, every implication. He had long suspected that Harry's departure from royal life and his public statements could create complications, but the precise details, the official report, crystallized the problem. This was no longer about family disagreements or personal choices. It had escalated to a matter of state, of national security, and of institutional preservation. The words sank in slowly, the silence between them thick, almost physical, as both men weighed what was necessary against what was devastating. William spoke carefully, his voice measured and calm, each phrase carrying the weight of duty and foresight. He reminded his father that the monarchy could not afford delay or hesitation. Keeping Harry's titles, delaying action, or allowing ambiguity would signal weakness to the public and to allies alike. Charles, though still emotionally tied to his youngest son, understood the wisdom in William's words. Every instinct, every paternal desire to protect and forgive, collided with the cold arithmetic of responsibility. The advisors had explained the mechanics of what needed to be done: official documents, constitutional procedures, legal approvals, and the precise language required to strip titles without leaving loopholes. It was a methodical process, not a personal vendetta, yet each step felt like cutting away a piece of his own flesh. Charles instructed the advisors to draft the documents, emphasizing that the language must not appear punitive. He wanted it framed as necessity, protection of the institution, preservation of history, rather than a judgment against his son. The advisors exchanged glances, understanding both the gravity and the delicacy of the task. Over the next few hours, drafts were rewritten, reviewed, and refined. Every word was weighed: revoke versus remove, status versus titles, necessary versus required. The king read each draft multiple times, each review leaving him heavier, the weight of responsibility pressing more firmly on his shoulders. William watched, silent but attentive, recognizing the care with which his father approached the procedure. Despite the familial distance, there was a mutual understanding that this was unavoidable. The final document was prepared, formatted with official letterhead, legal phrasing, and all necessary seals. Its formality contrasted sharply with the devastation it represented. Charles took a deep breath, placing his hand over the pen. He paused, thinking of Harry as a boy, the laughter, the scraped knees, the innocence now lost, replaced by a man whose choices had forced this outcome. William remained still, offering no comfort, only the silent reinforcement that the institution must endure. The palace seemed suspended in time as the king signed the document. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, careful, precise. There was no display of anger, no cry of frustration, only the quiet execution of a legal and constitutional mandate. The act itself was simple in form, but devastating in consequence. The signed papers would be processed, recorded, and officially communicated, severing Harry's formal connection to the monarchy and erasing his titles. Yet outside, London moved on, unaware, ordinary as ever. Streets bustled, tourists snapped photographs, and life carried forward, indifferent to the monumental choice made behind palace walls. The signing completed, Charles placed the documents in the hands of his advisers, who handled them with care, fully aware of the symbolic weight they carried. William spoke then, quietly, confirming that the process had been followed correctly, that nothing had been left to chance, and that all constitutional measures had been observed. He reminded his father that while the act was legally necessary, the emotional and familial consequences were profound, yet unavoidable. Charles understood. For decades he had known that the crown would demand sacrifice, that personal feelings would at times conflict with duty, and that historical precedent often favored the institution over the individual. He had studied monarchs who had faced betrayal, scandal, and exile, understanding that while history could judge, it could not relieve the immediate pain. Now it was his turn. He had acted decisively, legally, formally. There was no turning back. Hours passed, and the palace continued its rhythm. Meetings were held, letters processed, official communication prepared, yet behind every procedure was the echo of personal loss. Charles remained seated, reflecting on the intersection of family and duty, understanding that while the monarchy might survive, the bonds of love and trust had been fundamentally altered. William eventually left, quiet, leaving Charles alone with the knowledge of what had been done and the weight of the decisions that would ripple forward through time. The room seemed emptier, colder, as though the very air had been affected by the act. The documents resting now in their official channels, unstoppable. And yet, even in this silence, Charles felt the persistence of paternal love, complicated by the necessity of responsibility. He had protected the crown, preserved the institution, and adhered to the dictates of history. But he had also enacted a personal devastation that would remain with him forever. The formal process complete, the advisers departed, leaving the king to reflect in solitude. Time passed slowly as he considered the consequences, the legal clarity of the action, the public perception, the political stability ensured, and the personal cost incurred. Letters and documents confirmed the execution of the decision, each one a reminder of the irreversible step taken. The palace remained outwardly calm, yet inside, history had shifted, and the family would never be the same. Charles knew that in the coming hours, the news would spread, messages would be received, questions asked, and reactions measured. He understood that the public might admire his resolve, question his empathy, or condemn the act as cruel. Yet all of that was secondary to the fact that the action was necessary, unavoidable, and fully within the bounds of constitutional procedure. As evening approached, the palace settled into its familiar rhythms, ordinary to anyone outside, extraordinary for those within. Every decision, every signature, every careful step had been taken, and yet the personal loss remained immeasurable. Charles understood that the act of stripping his son of titles, though executed with legal precision and framed as institutional necessity, carried consequences no law could measure. The severing of family ties, the reshaping of relationships, and the emotional distance that would likely never heal. In the stillness of the study, surrounded by portraits of long-dead monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices, Charles sat quietly, reflecting on the collision of personal love and public duty. William's presence, calm and strategic, reinforced the understanding that history and responsibility could not be ignored. And though the palace continued its operations, the machinery of monarchy moving with practiced ease, the impact of the day's decisions lingered in the silence, the empty corridors, and in the quiet, heavy heart of a father who had acted as a king must, even when it meant profound personal loss. Across the Atlantic, in sunny California, Prince Harry received the news in a quiet, ordinary setting, starkly contrasting the weight of the decision. It arrived not as a phone call from his father, not from a brother, not even through a familiar voice he could trust, but via a formal email from the London legal offices. Clinical, distant, and precise, it informed him that certain decisions had been made regarding his status within the royal household. The language attempted to soften the blow, citing institutional necessity, constitutional procedure, and protection of the crown. But the words could not disguise the truth. Harry's titles were gone. Not suspended, not temporarily removed, but stripped entirely, erased through official channels, processed, signed, and sealed. He read the message 3 times, each reading confirming the grim reality. The titles had been more than ceremonial. They had represented history, belonging, identity, and connection to a family and an institution he had once served and been a part of. Now, that proof of his place, of his lineage, of his role within the monarchy, was gone, leaving an emptiness that could not be filled by words or explanation. Harry set the phone down, staring out at the California sun, bright and indifferent, filtering through the windows of the house he had hoped would be a sanctuary. The contrast between the ordinary world outside and the extraordinary devastation he had just received struck him with full force. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Cars passed on distant roads. Neighbors went about their lives, all unaware that in one home, a man had been officially erased from history. At first, Harry felt no anger, no rage, emotions he had often experienced in other conflicts with the press or the royal machine. Instead, there was a profound absence, a hollowing out that left him numb and disoriented. It was not a moment of shock alone, but the realization that his identity, built over decades and rooted in birthright and duty, had been formally revoked. Every title, every formal role, every acknowledgement of his place within the monarchy had been removed in a quiet act of legal authority. Calls from advisors and aides began immediately. Within minutes, teams were scrambling to strategize, to assess how the announcement would affect public perception, partnerships, and influence. Every organization Harry had worked with, every connection he had relied upon, every ally who had promised loyalty, was suddenly re-evaluating their support. Some hesitated, waiting for clarity. Others withdrew quietly, leaving him isolated. In that silence, he understood the full extent of the palace's actions. It was not merely the removal of titles. It was a deliberate framing, a construction of narrative, in which he became the problem, the liability, and the one to be excised to preserve the image of stability and control. Harry's mind raced through the past, replaying years of choices, grievances, and moments that had led to this day. His departure from royal life, his public interviews, his criticisms of the system, even his pursuit of independence, all of it now coalesced into a situation that had provoked this decisive action. The anger, the frustration, the desire to carve his own path, once a source of liberation, now seemed irrelevant against the cold machinery of institutional power. He walked through his California house slowly, each room feeling unfamiliar, each familiar object now a reminder of isolation. The space that had once felt like freedom, the house, the gardens, the sunny rooms, now seemed like a gilded prison. The removal of titles was not just a legal matter, it was a symbolic severing of identity. Harry realized that he would have to redefine himself entirely, outside of the framework that had shaped him from birth. The question of who he was, beyond being a prince, beyond being Harry of the royal family, became immediate, urgent, and unavoidable. Public reaction began to unfold, even before Harry could respond. News outlets across the globe picked up the story. Social media erupted with speculation, and commentators debated the morality, legality, and necessity of the decision. Opinions were divided, as expected. Some praised King Charles for his decisive action, viewing it as the protection of centuries-old institutions. Others condemned it as cold and heartless, a father choosing protocol over his child. The conversation was swift, loud, and unrelenting, leaving Harry in a strange limbo where the world knew his fate before he could even process it fully. His advisors urged statements, strategy, and public positioning, yet each option seemed inadequate. Speaking publicly might validate suspicions, confirm interpretations, or exacerbate the narrative already being constructed. Remaining silent, meanwhile, meant accepting a story told without his input, a version of events that could never fully reflect his perspective. Either path carried the weight of potential destruction. He thought about his family, about the ones he loved, and about the consequences for them. His actions, intentional or not, had created ripple effects that reached across oceans and borders, touching lives and reputations far beyond his own. This realization compounded the isolation he already felt, reinforcing the sense of exile even in a land of comfort and sunshine. As hours passed, the emotional weight settled more heavily. He reflected on childhood memories, the carefree days in palace gardens, moments of grief shared, and family connections once taken for granted. All of these now existed only as memories, unmoored from present reality. The titles had not just been symbols. They were a scaffold for identity, proof of belonging and purpose within a system that, despite its constraints, had defined him. The removal was total, and the emptiness it left was immediate and visceral. Harry sat by the window as the California sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room. The warmth and beauty of the light seemed indifferent to his pain, just as the world itself moved forward without pause or recognition of personal loss. He realized that while the monarchy had survived, he had been deliberately severed from its narrative, becoming both outside and untouchable, untethered from a history that had once belonged to him. For the first time in years, he felt completely alone in the public sense. Not merely physically, but socially, emotionally, and symbolically. Friends, organizations, and allies had already begun to distance themselves. Calls went unanswered. Previously reliable support networks now hesitated. It was as if the act of stripping him of his titles had also erased the certainty of loyalty, trust, and association, leaving him floating in a sea of uncertainty and suspicion. And yet, amidst the grief and disorientation, Harry also recognized a strange clarity. He was free, in a sense, from the formal constraints and obligations that had defined him since birth. He could chart his own course, define his own identity, and create meaning beyond the institution. But this freedom came at a cost that was immediate, painful, and inescapable. It was not liberation in the joyous sense. It was liberation accompanied by isolation, vulnerability, and the acute awareness that the world would watch, judge, and interpret his every move in light of what had happened. The days following the announcement unfolded in a blur of news coverage, analysis, and speculation. Every broadcast, every article, every social media post dissected the event from multiple angles, examining King Charles' decision, the legality of the process, the historical precedent, and the potential impact on the monarchy. Harry absorbed it all quietly, observing the reactions from a distance, processing the reality of public scrutiny in a way that no personal reflection could have prepared him for. Meanwhile, in London, the monarchy carried on. King Charles appeared at public engagements, smiling, interacting, performing duties with the practiced ease of a lifelong sovereign.